All right, everyone, we're just going to get started in a minute. I'm just going to give it a few more seconds to let people join. Okay, all right. Hello, everyone. Looks like most people here now. Few people may join, but we're going to get started. I'm John Federico, and I'll be the moderator for this panel. I'm a senior project manager at WSP USA, global planning and design firm. And my background is in both civil engineering and transportation planning. I'm based out of our Philadelphia office. So today's panel is titled Forces Shaping the Future of Transportation, and it's focused on the impacts from COVID on current and future transportation trends. So as we know, the pandemic has already dramatically changed the why, when, where, and how we travel. But these impacts really vary across the spectrum and depend very much on where you sit. So for instance, for many public sector officials, whether they be city officials or transit agencies, fiscal challenges are influencing how they respond to this pandemic. But at the same time, for many in the private sector, they're seeing some new opportunities. So this session is really going to focus on looking at some of the trends and looking at that public and private sector perspective. So the format of our session today is a panel discussion, and we have three panelists here with us who will provide each of these unique perspectives. Steve Buckley, who serves as the National Manager of Planning and Environmental Planning for WSP, will give a quick overview of the pandemic's impacts on travel patterns. Courtney Ehrlichman, who's head of strategy and policy at Panasonic's Smart Mobility Office, will bring the private sector perspective, while Mike Carroll, who we're waiting to join, and who is Deputy Managing Director for Philadelphia's Office of Transportation and Infrastructure Systems, also known as OTIS, will talk about how the public sector is responding. So we're going to start the session by giving each speaker about 10 minutes to provide some initial thoughts and perspectives, and then we're going to leave the rest of the session for discussion and roundtable discussion. So during that time, questions can be entered using the chat and Q&A function, which I'll then share with the panelists during the roundtable discussion. We'll try to fit in as many questions as we can with time permitting. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Steve Buckley to start. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, John. And I'd like to first thank our guest here for joining us today on this panel. Again, to sort of, what's going on in the world in the public and private sector perspective and responses to it, I think is a sort of a very timely topic. So just to get us started here, obviously the pandemic's influenced a lot of things. My background is engineering and planning, but the one key thing is really, I think what we're struggling with right now is what is it that we plan for the next 5 to 10 years. So I think in the short term, we sort of have we have our arms around what's happened or what's happening. Obviously, we're seeing a substantial reduction in trips, VMTs bouncing back, and we'll go into that a little bit. Obviously, working from home is becoming, for many, the new norm. Our peak trips are down substantially. Our transit trips are down substantially. Congestion, for the most part, is down substantially. And we're seeing an increase in e-commerce. So we'll circle back on this as we move forward and close with sort of what we think may be happening in the mid to long term. So obviously, VMT is bouncing back. So this is a graphic from Streetlight Data showing through about September this year. So as you can see, sort of going back into the start of this year, we're starting to see the VMT sort of bounce back after that major trail in the March-April timeframe. However, it's a little different depending on where you are. Obviously, the urban areas saw a bigger drop in VMT and are coming back a little slower. So in the rural areas, we're sort of kind of back to where we were. People are still making those trips and putting the VMT together, but in the urban areas, we're tending to see it coming back at about 80 to 90%. So this here is some information. This is from INREX. This is showing many of the major metropolitan areas throughout the US. As you can see, the US on average, they're looking at still about a 10% reduction. This one goes through about mid-November. But in most of the cities, you're still seeing about a 20 to 30% reduction in VMT travel. However, transit's a bit of a different story. To the left side here, we have the New York operations, and on the right graphic, it's the Chicago commuter operations. And as you can see, pretty telling in both. The bus service has actually bounced back quite a bit. So we're seeing sort of at this point maybe a 40 to 50% reduction in bus trips, both in New York and Chicago. But where we see the long and lasting impacts tends to be the longer regional rail lines. So in those situations, and again, similar to what we're seeing in Philadelphia, we're still seeing ridership down 70, 80, perhaps even 90%. Obviously, some good work that's been done here by McKinsey looking at sort of decision making pre-COVID and today. And obviously, what we've seen is that pre-COVID, the risk of infection or disease wasn't really very high on the priority list of most people. However, today that has become paramount, and it was sixth on the list before, both for private and for business and commuting trips, and immediately has risen to the top. So obviously people are feeling a little insecure about this, and how transit comes back is going to be how it comes back and how quickly it comes back is going to be completely dependent upon the comfort level I think that riders feel when they do return. This is an interesting one. Now, this is desired, not necessarily what businesses are going to do, but this is a information from CBRE, which is a real estate firm, the appeal of working from home. So this survey was done toward the end of the summer, and this is asking the question of, when COVID ends, where would you prefer to work? Full-time at the office, only about 6% people responded that they'd be back to full-time at the office. A lot of folks, about 10%, responded they'd be about 3 days plus a week at the office. But the big number here is, as you can see, and unfortunately my screen's blocking this, 56% of people are showing that they'd prefer to work remotely either full-time or most days of the week. And if you include sort of 2 or 3 days a week, that number goes up to 86%. So there's obviously from an employee standpoint, very big interest in the remote working aspect of this. Now, this isn't an employer survey, so it's not necessarily whether employers are going to be comfortable with this, but obviously what we've seen, I think, is a sort of major sea change in terms of how people are responding, how they're learning to work remotely. And I believe that we're probably going to see a lot of employers at a minimum show some additional flexibility in terms of how their workforce returns. This is going to be important because it greatly influences how much office space is needed, how many people are in downtown cores, how many people are in office parks, when, where, and how people get to those jobs as well. The ability to work from home, and again, this is sort of just some interesting background here. Obviously, many of the higher income white collar jobs are sort of seeing the ability to work from home a little bit more. And what we have is a lot of lower wage jobs or middle wage jobs that are requiring people to show up in person. So again, this ends up perhaps influencing what we'd call choice trip makers. So a lot of the commuter rail folks who perhaps used to spend a half hour, 45 minutes to an hour commuting for white collar jobs are finding out that they can successfully work remotely from home. And the question is, will they return? And will we see that ridership return to many of those regional rail lines? Again, these are Pennsylvania stats from the Center for Public Policy. But this shows the unemployment rate in comparison to the start of COVID for various income grades. And as you can see, in Pennsylvania at least, on the high wage side, the unemployment number, the number of employed people in high wage has actually increased by 1.9%. Middle wage, which is defined as $27,000 to $60,000, has decreased by about 5%, and low wage, under $27,000 per year, has decreased by about 20%. Again, a key part here is that the COVID has hit those jobs perhaps on the lower end of the economic spectrum a little bit harder, and we're going to have to think a little bit about how we get those people back to work. While they may be now having to go back to work because they can't work remotely, many of those folks may have to continue to depend upon public transportation. So we have to think about how we continue to provide that service for the lower end of the economic spectrum. And then finally, the last thing I want to touch upon was the rise of e-commerce. And this is from a book called Post-Corona. But basically the punchline of this graphic here is that that we were looking at about a 1% increase in retail sales online over the course of the last decade. And then basically in the 8 weeks at the start of 2020, we saw a 10 percentage point increase. So basically what we see is in 8 weeks, we've seen the growth in e-commerce of about a decade in time. So COVID has really sort of accelerated sort of this push toward e-commerce, and as we'll see, things like home delivery. Again, year-over-year sales here, we're looking at upwards of 100 to 150% increase year-over-year for home delivery services. And likewise, as many of us have probably been guilty of, even doing things like home delivery of food services as well. So in the short term, again, we sort of know some of the big trends. I think what we're likely going to see is that as trip making returns, we're going to see kids going back to school. But even if we saw people working 1 day a week remotely now in comparison to what they used to do, that potentially could be a 20% decrease in the number of to-work trips. To-work trips tend to make up about 60% of the AM commute and about 40% of the PM commute. So a substantial reduction in trips, even of 8 to 10%, could have significant impacts on many things. So we're likely going to continue to see trips going down. I believe we're likely going to see I'll say the next 2 years, VMT continue to stay down. Work from home, I think, is going to continue to remain high. But what we may see, though, is that the peak trips, while they may return, it may not return in such a peak anymore. Likewise, I think transit's going to have a bit of a time rebounding until people get comfortable that that the communication of disease cannot occur in sort of those perhaps high density locations. And we will likely see a continued, I'll say, lowering of congestion in comparison to pre-COVID. Likewise, we'll see, I think everyone's become comfortable with sort of pushing the button here. I suspect we'll likely see e-commerce remain. Now, how do we plan for that over the longer term? Oops. We really don't know what it's going to mean for trip making. I do suspect, though, with some of the forces, particularly work from home, remaining in place, that we will continue to see a reduction in trips, particularly work trips, VMT, and particularly peak period trips. However, again, how quickly people return to transit may influence those number of peak trips. And then transit, when it does come back, and I do believe it will come back, I suspect we're still going to see it riding beneath where it was pre-COVID. Some of the big questions around things like congestion are, as we have many cities looking at congestion like New York, DC, Seattle, looking at things like congestion pricing, what does that mean in terms of influencing the ability to do things like congestion pricing moving forward? And I do feel like we're likely going to continue to see a growth in e-commerce. So finally, on the last piece here, a key piece to this, and Mike can comment on this as well, is everything from VMT hitting the gas tax to fare box revenue is resulting in a number of public sector revenue losses. And we got to look for new and innovative ways to sort of be able to refund this and ensure that we're continuing to invest in transportation. All right, so I'll wrap it up there.
Great. All right, thanks, Steve. And I think that last slide is a good transition over to Mike. So Mike, if you want to jump in now with your initial thoughts.
Sure thing. So let's see, get this up here.
Yep, should be able to just share your screen there.
Yeah, I had wait till Steve. Okay.
There we go.
So thanks everyone for giving me a chance to talk about this from the Philadelphia perspective. I'm trying to get this up here. Let me try one more time. Hold on.
And it did come up on screen. It was just not in presentation mode yet.
Okay.
There we go. I can see it. I can see all your slides right there.
Okay. Switch to presentation mode. Okay.
And
all right, great.
There
Sorry
you go.
about that. Okay, so yeah, I think that's great. Steve set the table with a lot of the trends we're seeing around the country and in Philadelphia, and I just want to give a little bit of perspective of, you know, the relationship between what we're seeing in the changes activity, which reflect themselves both in budgetary impacts and in transportation impacts, and sort of set the table for what we're doing right now in order to try and survive the pandemic, and hopefully kind of give us some guidance about how we come out and we continue to recover in the spring. We're all hoping and praying for a vaccine to come and start to restore things closer to normal, and being prepared for that is a big part of what we're working on now, understanding that not everything is going to go exactly the way it was before, but we're going to have to figure out ways to sort of trend back towards a lot of the things that make cities where people want to work, where people want to set up their businesses, where they want to live. And there's a big quality of life, question that hangs over all of this stuff. The reason why cities have been very successful over the last 20 years or so, more so than in previous eras, because, really cities make good on a quality of life proposition for people at the same time that, people's families were starting to be structured a little bit differently. Their household needs were starting to be a little bit more compatible with cities, and cities kind of got their act together around a lot of things. And so this is a gut punch with the pandemic, because it's sort of taken a lot of those things people like off the table. And just to start with, this is really materially, directly, you can't do the things that you would want to do in a city, because they're prohibited under the conditions where you can't go inside and be inside of a store, you can't be inside of a restaurant. And that ebbs and flows, we've seen over the last few months where you can do a little bit. But the fact is that when you talk to entrepreneurs, the uncertainty is as big a problem for them as any of the one levels of restriction. They need to plan out a whole year's budget. They need to plan out their investments. They need to plan out their hiring. They need to plan out, how they're going to market themselves to their customers. And when that's changing on a monthly basis, the proposition, the risks involved get to the point where you're seeing businesses that are shutting down temporarily, and you see businesses that are shutting down permanently because they just can't weather these sorts of fluctuations going forward. So, ideally, as we get into the next year, we'll start to see that the certainty, the kind of the pace of people getting vaccines is consistent. But also, we're going to want there to be consistent support from all levels of government, the city doing everything it can, but also from the state and the feds. And I'll talk about that a little bit. The right of way is just kind of nuts now. And part of that's traffic not adhering to normal patterns. Talk about that in a little bit. But part of it is like the things we're trying to do to make the right of way work. So we're supporting the fact that there's no indoor dining by doing a lot of things between the curbs that we normally wouldn't do. We've had historically ideas about a lot of this stuff and tried it out here and there, but we've really sort of rapidly expanded without a roadmap. Things like what we call streeteries, which are sort of like these parklet type structures, which allow folks to kind of set up and sit and eat in the parking spaces. And now these are turning into structures where there's sides and roofs, and people are trying to figure out how to winterize these things as the weather gets colder. We're starting to allow for different activities that don't involve dining. So there's been some sort of retail that's been set up in some locations, and even gym-like activities. So we've figured out ways to get folks on exercise bikes in the parking lane, because during certain periods of the last year, you haven't been able to do that inside of an enclosed space. So, these types of things are popping up. Folks were interested in shutting streets down to hold classes in person. So we had conversations with some charter schools about that. You name it, if it's something that could have happened indoor, but isn't allowed indoors, people have asked, and we've been able to have been successful in figuring out how to get those sorts of things going on the right of way. At the same time, though, there's been this kind of real condensing of construction activity, because construction wasn't allowed to happen for 3 months at the beginning of the construction season. We only allowed certain types of things to take place, which were deemed, essential at first, but then that even became more restrictive in, certain areas. We only allowed things that were life-sustaining to go forward. And, I guess the silver lining is perhaps during that period, we had an opportunity to implement COVID safety protocols and to enforce COVID safety protocols with different contractors working the right of way. So, these folks are typically working in very close quarters, but to make sure that they had a chance to kind of get PPE, they had a chance to kind of train their workers. Maybe that was a silver lining. Another thing that's worth mentioning in the city of Philadelphia, up until maybe not yet, maybe this next month, there was a legislated a sunset in the tax abatement, which allowed for new construction, especially residential properties, to see a 10% reduction in their tax bill. So everyone wanted to get their buildings built this year. So you take that and combine it with the reduction in the time that was available to do that. And we've had a real crunch of activity, which has required, closures in the right-of-way, closures on the footway. So less space to work with, a lot more going on. The big story I think we're all going to talk about is work from home, and trying to figure out how to accommodate work from home, even as a city government, is a big deal. So, a lot of the same things that the private sector is experiencing in terms of learning how to be productive working away from home are also factors we see in city government. There's issues that relate to the way that we operate. Some jobs have to be in person. You just have to be there to fix something with your hands. You need to drive somewhere to go do some inspections, and you have to, go to where the vehicles are. You have to go to where your files are. And so trying to figure out how to split the difference has been a real trick. And, we've seen in working from home, working remotely, meeting virtually, both with the public, doing public meetings, but also doing meetings across city government. There have been some efficiencies. I want to be honest about that. We're certainly seeing the same things maybe some folks in the private sector are seeing. There's kind of less moving around from place to place and more, as I'm sure a lot of us experience, just, clicking from one button from one meeting to the next within seconds flat. So, we're seeing that there's many more meetings that are getting done and fit in, and, that does lead to productivity gains. People are able to stay in touch in different ways, but there's also costs. And I think we need to be frank about that, especially for families, people who have children in the house. There's issues that relate to bandwidth, and that affects city workers just like it affects everyone else. So we've had to learn a lot of lessons and, figure out what we can do moving forward. I think that there's definitely some incentives for us to continue figuring out how to do this, because, it could save the city money if we're not paying for rents. And if, we can kind of make this an amenity for certain titles in city government, it's something that we can, actually figure out how to make work for us. But it does increase, in some respects, some disparities. So like I said, some people need to be in the field. And, trying to make sure that people who need to be in the field feel like their work is respected, and that there's every effort being made to make sure that they're safe is important. And, when we fail to do that, the issues we see are, real problems with our productivity, real problems with our service levels, and, the complaints start flooding in. So just to focus a little bit on some of the budgetary impacts, speaking from SEPTA's perspective, Steve kind of gave you an overview of what the transit picture looks like. The latest data that I've had a chance to look at shows, there's about a 60 to 65% year-on-year reduction in transit ridership. It's focused though on the rail mode. So regional rail being impacted the most, down to about 90% on some weeks, 85 to 90% generally over the last month or so, and even going back before that. Subway and elevated is more in the sort of like the 70-75% range, not quite as bad as regional rail, but not quite as robust as the bus transit. So this speaks to a couple different things, and I think this will be important going forward in terms of SEPTA's own strategies, but also the way that we think about transportation in the city. That disparity is really a reflection of folks who have, cars available to themselves, maybe have the ability to work from home, and those who don't. Transit riders, the bus network is, overrepresented. Customers are overrepresented by people who don't have access to a car. Maybe lower income, folks who are older, folks who are, maybe in distressed neighborhoods. And so they are what we have been calling, previously transit dependent in significant ways. And so we have decisions to make whether to kind of take these folks and consider them to be sort of like the base of our customer, our customers, how to really serve them, increase and grow their ridership. At the same time, we're thinking about how to get what we would call perhaps choice riders and entice them back, because we're seeing about $1 million less in fare collections today than we were previously about a year ago. And the folks who are kind of holding the roof up are the people who we call transit dependent. So what that really means is that dependency works both ways. The entity depends on these people continuing to use transit as much as they depend on transit. We need to elevate that relationship and figure out how to make it work better for everyone. There are some savings, as we talked about, the service reductions, the fewer rail lines, less frequency, that does help SEPTA weather the storm a little bit, but that's only going to get us so far. Inside city government, we predicted about a $700 million shortfall in operating budgets, and we're around a little bit north of 650. So, kudos for great predictions, but the pain is there nonetheless. And, what this means is budget reductions, staff reductions. We're trying out again, how to do more with less. And, that's not new for the city of Philadelphia. So in some ways we have some experience, but, we're piling on a crisis on top of a pretty intense situation overall. And that leads to service, risk. Us not being able to do the things people depend on, that could have a vicious circle effect, because we're going to depend on that quality of life to really make people reinvest in cities, recommit to being in cities. And so that's a real concern. On the capital side, we're seeing that there's delays. The costs are higher, and I could talk a little bit about that. It's mostly in my mind about the schedule compression. There's a lot going on, and also the need for them to take on the cost of COVID protocols. But we're at the point where we're actually canceling certain contracts. And so, that work is still needing to get done. Perhaps we'll see the price tag come down on some of these things, and we'll reach some sort of equilibrium. That will help. But generally speaking, we just need more revenue or more funds. And so we're really going to depend on the federal and state government to kind of unlock the resources that are already in their hands, and especially the state level, make sure that the funds move, the COVID relief funds move. But also we're going to hope for good news soon on the federal level with respect to more relief. And this is, it has to be fiscal relief. It has to be direct support. We can save the situation, but we need that stuff to show up quickly. And we'll look forward to, stimulus, investment in infrastructure. And, that's something I think medium term could lead to a good story like it did last time. But in the meantime, we really need to get that far. We need to kind of survive long enough to take advantage of that. So on the transportation piece, I won't reiterate too much what Steve talked about, but we're seeing, lower volumes bouncing back in terms of vehicle traffic. So peak spreading, I think, especially in the AM, people don't necessarily need to all be in the same place at 8:30, 9 o'clock the way they did in the past. And, most of the peaking seems like it's condensed in the evening, one way or the other, afternoon and evening. That shift is there, as discussed, from transit to auto, again, especially on the rail modes. And the one thing I'd mention is that, along with the health crisis, there's been a traffic safety crisis. The roads are a little bit more empty. And unfortunately, there's a lot of knuckleheads out there who want to treat their local streets like raceways. And, people are sort of cooped up and they want to get out and they want to move around. And a lot of people just haven't figured out how to do that in a safe way. So we've really blown our statistics in terms of people who've been killed and seriously injured over the past 7 months, really blown it out of the water. And that's it's very depressing. I wish there was a great answer. There's a lot of sensitivity right now around the ways that we enforce traffic laws, and that hasn't helped. And so I think that we're looking for solutions to that. I think long-term, we're very much interested in the city in automated enforcement. This summer, we put in place the pilot on Roosevelt Boulevard with automated speed cameras. They're working. Violations are being generated, and we are seeing some improvement in the speeds on the boulevard as intended. So that's something we want to make sure we can follow through on, not just on the boulevard, but also on other major streets on our what we call our high injury network, and want to make sure that we can take advantage of the success there and replicate it in different parts of the city. I think that's really our best bet for a lot of these issues. So looking forward, I think, again, maybe the silver lining of all this is it's really kind of forced our hand in terms of rethinking the right of way. As I mentioned before, there'd been a lot of interest in figuring out how to pedestrianize different types of streets in the city. Thinking through the way the network works as a network, how we prioritize certain streets for certain uses, whether it's transit, whether it's bikes, whether it's, walking, deliveries, whatever it is, we have the opportunity to really make more use of our right of way by managing the time and space dynamics. And, this boils down especially to the curb side, figuring out whether a piece of curb for a given day, a given hour, a given week, a given month is available for outdoor dining, whether it's available for parking, whether it's available for, peak hour car travel, whether it's available exclusively for buses. That opportunity to really kind of treat the streets, treat the right of way dynamically is something that a city like Philadelphia, where we're not building a lot of new streets, had always been attractive. But now we see that it's essential, and we've got a little experience in how to do it. So, one of the things that we moved forward with in this street closure pilot was a temporary street closure pilot program. And that allowed for sponsors, and typically it was business improvement districts, but sometimes a handful or even a single restaurant, to establish sort of a outdoor dining plaza between the curbs from, at first it was just Thursday to Sunday, had good success, kind of stretched it out on the Labor Day weekend to include the Monday. And right now in the city, we have this going on in some places on basically a 7-day basis. And so lots of folks are interested, and there's a robust conversation for making this permanent in the spring, and even figuring out how to make this something people can do on a greater basis to get through the winter. And so, what we're looking at is over the next few months, really planning out as best we can how we can establish these programs on an ongoing basis that really allow the street to be managed in a much more flexible way. We've got a lot of work to do, but there's a real sense that really hits the nail on the quality of life question that sort of is existential for cities about whether people are going to come back. And, it's been the good news story in a lot of ways. People like it. They like seeing their streets used this way. And so what we need to do is to figure out how to leverage that energy coming out of the pandemic to really re-energize people, to get them to come back and make cities, the place to be again moving forward. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks a lot.
Great. All right. Thank you, Mike. And now I'm going to turn it over to our third panelist, Courtney. Perhaps you can share your thoughts from the private perspective.
Great, thank you. And I'm really sorry I can't be there in person with everyone today. That would be fantastic. And I also apologize. I've just started a new position at Panasonic, as mentioned. So I've been asked to hold back on slides because I haven't gotten the corporate go ahead yet. So I'm going to be speaking, but I'm also recording so that I can provide a transcript later and hopefully some slides. So I wanted to first thank Steve for showing the hockey stick graph from Scott Galloway, because I think that that's incredibly dramatic for the private sector. Hockey stick growth is always their goal. And so what we're seeing in work from home is impacting so many different aspects of the transportation industry. And like Steve said, most people are going to want to stay working from home part of the time. So that, and we've also seen from one of these front row cities, San Francisco, big technology firms that are now saying you can work from anywhere. So not work from home, but work from anywhere. And that's like the likes of Twitter and Facebook. And what's really fascinating about that is that completely impacts their real estate market. And we know for them, they don't have enough housing. And so it's interesting because that will impact the housing market across the country, what happens in San Francisco. And that will also start to impact, policies around different pay levels. I should also say that I am now working from home in Pittsburgh, and my office is in Denver. So it's also created opportunities to expand talent pools from beyond your home base. What also is interesting is that Amazon is now planning to put 1,000 warehouses in suburban neighborhoods. Historically, they're on the ex-urban fringes, but they're now offering same-day service, or trying to offer same-day service. Walmart and Target are also getting on board with that, which is a significant threat to USPS. And, these warehouses in suburban neighborhoods can generate over 1,000 vehicle trips each day. So we will also, we're losing perhaps city focus, and we're really going to start seeing some impact on the suburbs. And, I like to joke that, when is Amazon going to start building apartments within their warehouses so you can just live and get your products there? I think the other piece to mention here that's interesting is former Secretary Fox's Beyond Traffic 2045 really talked about the inequity between suburbs and cities, and that low-income folks would be pushed out to the suburbs. So this is just interesting to see how things are starting to settle out. So we've got obviously this massive increase because people are working from home, they're staying at home. Delivery is catching up. They're planning for this increase to stay up. Right now, I think there's concern about people getting their packages on Christmas on time because everything is so saturated. I spent some time speaking with people at the national level and even the global level that are really concerned about the supply chain breakdown. And, I don't know if that has borne much fruit. Hopefully it won't, but I think we may start seeing some impact now that coronavirus is back with a vengeance. Food delivery has increased dramatically. I would say that's another hockey stick opportunity, tons of investment there. We can talk about Uber a little bit later with AVs, but that was their, where they were actually making money was in their food delivery. Driverless delivery has taken off. There's been some partnerships, Nuro and Kroger, Cruise and Walmart. Nuro actually released a report that I'll just list a few stats out here. Between 2025 and 2035, last mile autonomous delivery services will generate 4.1 trillion in economic activity and prevent 348,000 road injuries. Those are bold statistics. And they also mentioned that they will save 407 million tons of CO2 emissions. Here in Pennsylvania, as you may or may not know, some personal delivery, driverless delivery legislation was passed allowing vehicles up to 550 pounds traveling at up to 15 miles per hour on the sidewalk. So they're essentially being classified as pedestrians. And that was pushed by FedEx and Amazon. So they're trying to get all the space they can, whether it's on the roadway, in the bike lane, or on the sidewalk. There's obviously concern that I won't get into here about the size and weight and speed of those vehicles. And I think that there is an opportunity to get feedback on that right now to PennDOT. So with the increase of delivery, we're starting to see, like an Amazon is now investing in an electric vehicle, an electric delivery van. So they've put an order in for 10,000 vehicles to have these by 2021, and they're hoping to have 100,000 of these by 2030. Now, these electric vehicle delivery vans, these e-delivery vans, are also going to have data analytics built right into the hardware, the whole system within the vehicle. So it will be really interesting to see how logistics innovates sort of at the last mile with their vehicles. We're also seeing some drone activity. I think I saw something the other day about how new homes need to incorporate drone landing platforms or drone delivery services within them. That's pretty futuristic, but interesting. In the AV world, a lot happened in the past year. I think being 2020 and we were supposed to have AVs at full scale, full penetration in the market. I think that has been recognized as not happening, and sort of had a wake-up call in the industry, in the investment world, on how realistic that time frame was. And now that's been pushed back. And when I am able to provide my slides post presentation, I will also include the failed deployment timeline. Mercedes ditched level 5, which is fully autonomous. So they are not even seeking to achieve that anymore. Obviously, Uber in Pittsburgh just sold off their unit to Aurora, which is actually really fascinating to think about rideshare and rideshare business models. Ride sharing has decreased. They need to figure out how to provide cleanliness within the vehicles in terms of disinfecting, but that also picked back up with VMT. And I think the fact that Aurora is now, or that Uber sloughed off their AV research to Aurora, means Uber may very well just lose in the ride sharing space and focus more on the food delivery and the delivery spaces. But that remains to be seen. And that's obviously just my take on that. So with Mercedes dropping level 5, and Mercedes is part of the Daimler group, Daimler actually opened an office in Portland, which is it's a US location, and partnered with Waymo on driverless trucks. So again, working in logistics. And they've also created, in their location in Portland, Daimler their trucks division created a connectivity services group. So I think connected and AV freight is moving forward at a great speed, obviously, because it ties into all of the e-commerce that's happening. And so you've seen startups like Locomation, that's local to Pittsburgh, developing partnerships, and Ike, which is another AV freight company, developing partnerships with DHL and others. One interesting thing is Motional, which is formerly Active, or it might just be they're formerly Active, has partnered with Via, which is known for their work in transit. So we're going to start seeing potentially AV vehicles being plugged into transit, and I think that goes beyond the driverless shuttle. Now, I will just say, I don't think that there has been a lot of development in AV shuttles in 2020. There was a huge story about the Navia shuttle down in Florida delivering medicine to a hospital. I think that was really just a PR ploy. It was actually a closed track. There was someone leading the vehicle, someone behind the vehicle, and there really wasn't anything unique about the vehicle, except there was no one in it during that time. But I think with freight and other augmentations to a regular vehicle with a driver, we'll see that not necessarily moving forward. Another thing that was really interesting is there's been a huge uptick in pickup truck sales this year. As you can imagine, people are trying to get out and adventure. And so Rivian has sort of come out onto the scene as a big winner this year in electric pickup trucks. And there was actually a survey sent out, a pickup truck sentiment survey, And a lot of the folks that did buy pickup trucks were millennial city dwellers that were intending on buying a car and instead bought a pickup truck, and in their next purchase expect to buy an electric pickup truck. So that's just interesting public perspective. I want to speak to bicycles because I see there's questions in the chat about that. Bikes have gone off the charts this year. Obviously, I am a fan of bikes. Micromobility has seen, a whole host of different legislative regulatory regimes from different cities. But bikes specifically, e-cargo bikes sales are up 50%. E-bike sales, again, off the charts. US bike shops had an insane spike in demand, 121%. This is really wild and both good and bad because we don't have a lot of dedicated infrastructure for that. So hopefully we'll move forward on that. In terms of electric vehicles, there's been some investments in EV buses. Nikola came onto the scene. Tesla released full self-driving in beta. I think that's of note because that's both electric and autonomous. And that was one thing that I think really came to the forefront this year was EAVs, which is combining electric and autonomous vehicles together and really joining that conversation. And I think we're going to hopefully see a chain. We don't have a federal framework for AVs yet, but we'll hopefully see something along those lines. And we don't have a national EV charging network. Tesla has their own. Rivian has also announced they're going to be creating their own. In terms of connected vehicles, there's been still some deployments going on. And I think tomorrow there's a session that will be talking specifically about some of those. The big thing this year, which just happened a few weeks ago, was the FCC ruling on the spectrum and the big blow to the transportation industry, opening up that spectrum to 5G and Wi-Fi. So I think we should be keeping an eye on that. The other piece that I just wanted to mention was parking. There's a company called Reef Parking that raised $700 million. They were a parking company and they now are calling themselves a mobility logistics hub and neighborhood kitchen company. Ghost kitchens are something that have really come to the forefront again with retail restaurant ship becoming a safety concern. And one of the other things I wanted to mention in my work with state DOTs is a major concern with their budgets, with both, they're already feeling pain with the gas tax, but now with the drop in VMT, that compounds the gas tax issue. So there's been a lot of work around road usage charging as well. I'm going to end there and hopefully we can just have a conversation.
Great. Okay. Steve, Courtney, Mike, thank you so much for your perspectives and pretty much covering so many different aspects of the transportation system. I know the uptick in the amount of Amazon Prime vehicles that I've seen recently in the last few weeks has been tremendous on the street. But since we only have about 10 minutes left, I had a couple preset questions, but I want to just open it up to the Q&A chat questions so that we can cover some of the questions coming in from folks, and you can continue to put those in there. So the first one is from one of our attendees who's preparing a transportation master plan for a large central New Jersey municipality. And he's getting ready to tell the town to focus less on large roadway windings and more on bike, hike, safety, maintenance, and spot congestion. And wanted to get the group's thoughts. And I know this is actually very relevant to myself as well, a question I have as I'm working on an integrated land use and transportation plan for another New Jersey municipality. And there's so many questions about the TOD aspect of it and what's going to happen with development, as well as the transportation aspect, whether it's the transit component or the congestion component. So going back to your question though, when we think about master planning, how does this change things in terms of recommendations to towns, to cities, related to congestion, roadway widenings, and then other modes of transportation and safety? I don't know if Mike or Steve? Perhaps?
I'll jump in. I think that's probably the right approach, depending where you're at. There's, generally in all types of different contexts, probably a little bit of a shift in focus we could all benefit from towards, non-motorized transportation generally, even as just an active transportation issue, if nothing else. And so what I would suggest, I guess, is that it makes sense to try and show the differences in life cycle costs between the investment and maybe sort of a cost benefit, perspective in terms of the quality of life, like I've been talking about. You're going to see a lot of peers out there, lots of cases out there that demonstrate how these things have sort of paid off, and they tend to be cheaper to invest in. Frankly, large scale road widening projects are not cheap. They've never been cheap, and I don't see them getting cheaper really anytime soon. Now, if there is stimulus, there's going to be a lot of drive to do those types of things if there's, some infrastructure grants that come forward. But, dollar for dollar, if you can spend that kind of cash on these, urban realm enhancements, add in features like trails, bike lanes, you're gonna actually transform your city probably in a much more meaningful way. You'll be able to communicate that, I think, with lots of images to choose from.
Great. Anyone else? Okay.
Yes, I was just going to add, often your state DOTs have access to, there's just reams of great data out there now. And using some of the data out there, particularly if you're showing that volumes aren't coming back to where they were, and perhaps the issue of congestion, which may have been pushing the widening, might not be as intense as it was before. Using that type of data can often be very compelling in terms of bending the community to perhaps not taking bad actions.
Great, thanks. Okay, I'm going to jump to the next question that really is more focused on transit and convenience. It asks, how can device-based ticketing and trip planning, MOS, make transit convenient enough? And for instance, Uber, the last mile and first mile Uber, to transit to Uber. So what kind of things can be kind of done in this environment, maybe to help transit out, maybe from a technology perspective, from a convenience perspective?
I'd like to jump in on that one. I know there's probably others who want to talk. I think it's a really great question. It's one that in the US generally we're trying to figure out. But very materially, what we need to start with is interoperable systems. And so, getting a lot of players to be more open sourced, I think, is a step in the right direction. And the latest wave of entrepreneurs, and Courtney may want to talk about this a little bit too. You can kind of get your foot in the door, get your startup going if you take an open source approach, because you've already kind of embedded yourself in a network, a peer network that you can then collaborate with. And I'm, as a city person, interested in that because I don't want to become locked into anything. So if I'm feeding information, to someone and they're doing some fusing and integration of that information, I want to get it back. I don't want to have to pay for it. And if I'm sharing that as with SEPTA or police or real-time issues that happen with closures, I want to make sure that I'm joining in sort of a friendly collective ecosystem and not something where the data I provide goes into a black hole. And we have to figure that out. And I think things like mobility as a service really depend on us figuring some of this stuff out.
Yeah, and I will just jump in. Thanks for that, Mike. I think that was a really great perspective. And I would just add, from the transit perspective, I've been tracking a lot of these pilots, and a lot of the Uber transit pilots have been just pilots and not really proven to enhance necessarily the services or been financially sustainable. So I think what we're going to start seeing is just some different innovation in first and last mile. I know Pittsburgh, for example, is working on Move 412, which is a partnership with the Department of Mobility and Infrastructure, Port Authority, the Transit app. I think Zipcar, Citify, I'm probably forgetting, but they're trying to create that interoperable ecosystem. And they're also creating an opportunity for those that might be unbanked or not have a smartphone to also participate in that. And I think that is going to be really important. And we really have to see, I think, post-COVID, how this is all going to shake out. I mean, I was just on a call this morning about, post-pandemic transit scenarios, and the demand aspect together with the commuting demand decrease and the commuting decrease and sort of the unknowns there. I think this question is really on hold for now.
Okay, thanks both. The next question is for Mike. Specifically for Mike. So it's great to hear that the city's moving towards making more flexible use of right-of-way, creating policy, to encourage retail and resident-friendly uses. The question is, how can residents of Philadelphia help to make sure that these policies are supported by council and kind of ready to go once it's safe to reopen?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think City Council is pretty enthusiastic about this stuff, which is great right now. So when the other shoe drops, I think it'll just be important that they're comfortable that there are strong constituencies that want to see this. It may not be the same everywhere in the city, frankly, but in the denser parts of the city, along commercial corridors and places where I think there's already an established culture of using the streets, using the right of way in a more urban realm, urbanist way. I don't see that there will be a problem. Council folks may want to have a district level control. I don't necessarily think that's a great idea, and so maybe there's some work that goes into advocacy to do a citywide approach, maybe with a map that illustrates the types of places it shows up on. But the other thing I would say is try and be involved in the process, and we'll certainly need to do a lot of outreach, a lot of engagement at the neighborhood level to figure out where to start, where to pilot it, and if folks are interested and can kind of keep their eyes peeled for that, and we'll do virtual community meetings as best we can. Make sure we're getting the feedback we need kind of before, during, and after these pilots. That's the best thing I think people can do.
Okay, thanks. We've got a few minutes left and a couple questions left, so I'm going to see if we can squeeze these in. The next one also is for you, Mike, and they appreciate your reference to knuckleheads driving on our roads. And from Harrisburg, same experience in Harrisburg, seeing bad driving habits on interstates and through active construction zones. And it seems to them that part of the need comes from enforcement. However, we all know that enforcement right now in today's context has some challenges. So what are your thoughts on how to address this aspect of safety and how to get a handle on drivers and prevent more fatalities?
So I'm a huge fan of camera enforcement, automated enforcement, and I think we're pretty close to where we want to be in the state of Pennsylvania with the way that we do that. These tickets are not moving violations, so they don't carry points. There's a number of issues that we want to be careful around with respect to people's privacy, so to speak, and government intrusion, and there's an accountability issue that's out there. It's not always cost effective. I'll be frank about that. There are proceeds and revenues that can be generated on the really high ticket areas over periods of time. That's not the point. But in some places where you really want to have it, especially in lower density, lower traffic areas, it can be hard to generate enough revenue to pay for the expense of setting and maintaining these systems. And so, that is a question that needs to be answered. I think state support for it would be good. We pay for the live in-person police traffic enforcement, so we should be willing to pay for automated enforcement, without necessarily a prospect of great return. And it's just a safety issue. It's just a fundamental transportation issue we need to take responsibility for. There's probably some work to do legislatively at the state level to get kind of really right at that sweet spot. But I think we're starting to get comfortable with it and put our toe in the water. And I think it addresses a lot of different concerns.
And I just wanted to jump in. There was a new report that dropped from ZenDrive that 57% of collisions in 2020 crash data, 57% were related to phone use as well. So that's just worth noting.
Yeah,
that's a really good point. Okay, we're at 3 o'clock. I think we we have one last question. So in fairness to getting all the questions in, I'm going to ask this last question. With the vacancies, more downtown vacancies in office space and shifts in mode, a lot of it away from transit, have cities or municipalities been looking into, they say circulation planning? I'm not sure if that's supposed to be congestion planning, congestion pricing, but I guess looking to other cities outside of the United States to kind of limit single occupancy vehicle use in city environments, which maybe will become even more of an issue if these, at least in the medium term, if these trends away from transit continue.
I'll say yes and then stop.
Yeah, I can speak more freely. So, the good news is that most major cities are now looking at this in some way, shape, or form, congestion pricing. So, New York, San Francisco, Seattle, Washington, a lot of the cities are sort of starting to move toward this. And usually, what you need is one success story. And once that occurs, all the cities look and say, how come we're not doing that over there? So, and then sort of the dominoes fall. So New York was sort of leading it, and they were having some issues, I think, getting the approval through the feds, and it's been sort of paused for a while. But like I said, I think it's sort of the model that we've always talked about, and perhaps we're getting to an age now where it can be done infrastructure light, where we don't necessarily need to spend 30 or 40 cents to collect every dollar, because we have hardware and infrastructure and things like that. So all of this, nowadays you can start tracking with these things. So so I think we will start seeing that in the U.S. It'll just be probably it'll take a few cities to sort of move in that direction first, and we're not really sure what COVID's going to do to it. Courtney, anything to add to that?
I hope that more of this happens, I would say. And I think we have Paris has sort of talked about their 15-minute city. And I know a lot of planners are sort of taking that up as a model that, we'll see if that can track in the US. But yeah, I think we will start to see more of this in the coming years.
Okay, well, great. I think we got through all our questions. I want to very much thank all of our panelists today for their time. I want to thank everyone that attended the session. And with that, and the recording from the session will be available through the conference website. So thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.